In May of 2020, on Royal Caribbean's ship, Majesty of the Seas, crew members hung a sign on the pool deck that read, "How many more suicides do you need?" It was not a rhetorical question. In the span of about 10 days that same month, 4 crew members died under non-coronavirus circumstances across 4 different cruise companies. A 39-year-old Ukrainian woman jumped overboard from Princess Cruises' Regal Princess near Rotterdam. A contractor died aboard Royal Caribbean's Mariner of the Seas. A Filipino cook was found dead in his cabin on Carnival's Aida Blue. 4 days after that, another Filipino worker died in an apparent suicide aboard Virgin Voyages' Scarlet Lady. Roughly 200,000 seafarers worldwide were stranded on ships at that point, according to United Nations estimates, many of them confined to small, often windowless cabins for months, sometimes without full pay, while the passengers who had been sharing those same ships weeks earlier had already been flown home. To almost everyone who has ever taken a cruise, none of this looks anything like the industry they experienced. Cruise lines expected to carry around 36 million paying passengers in 2024 alone, 20% more than before the pandemic, built entirely around an image of tropical drinks, buffet lines, and effortless luxury. The people keeping that experience running, cleaning cabins, serving meals, working engine rooms, are almost never part of that image at all. The pay gap running through the same ship is stark on its own terms. A cruise line's top executives are typically compensated in the millions of dollars annually in salary, bonuses, and stock awards, negotiated under standard executive compensation practices in whatever country the company's headquarters actually operates from day to day. The crew serving that same executive's guests on the same ship are compensated under Liberian, Panamanian, or Bahamian labor standards instead, for work that, from the deck of the ship, looks identical to hospitality work done anywhere else in the world. So, how does an industry built on selling relaxation end up producing a pool deck protest sign, asking how many more of its own workers have to die before something changes? The mechanism behind that gap starts with a piece of maritime law that was never designed with cruise ships in mind at all. Flags of convenience originated decades earlier, mostly among American oil and cargo shipping companies looking for a way around domestic regulation and higher operating costs well before any cruise line existed at the scale they operate today. Liberia and Panama built entire registries specifically to attract that business, charging low registration fees and imposing minimal oversight on vessels that would never actually visit their coastlines. A Miami-based maritime lawyer who has represented injured cruise workers put it directly. Cruise lines want to register somewhere where they pay no taxes, are exempt from labor and wage statutes, and do not have to follow health and safety codes, he said, adding that what they're actually looking for is a country willing to leave them alone rather than oversee their operations in any meaningful way. Cruise lines adopted the exact same structure decades later, and it lets them do 2 things simultaneously that would otherwise be separate problems. Carnival has been incorporated in Panama since 1972. Royal Caribbean has been incorporated in Liberia since 1985. Norwegian Cruise Line is incorporated in Bermuda. None of these are countries most of their passengers, or for that matter, most of their crew, actually come from. They're chosen specifically because registering there lets a cruise line apply that country's labor law and that country's tax code to a ship that spends almost all its time somewhere else entirely. The tax side of that arrangement is easy to quantify because these are publicly traded companies required to disclose it. In 2019, Carnival paid $71 million in taxes on $3.06 billion in income, an effective rate of about 2.3%. Royal Caribbean paid $25.5 million in taxes on $1.8 billion in income that same year, a rate of about 1.4%. Norwegian paid $18.9 million in taxes on more than $911 million in income, a rate of about 2%. For context, the standard federal corporate tax rate in the United States is 21%, rising to nearly 26% once state and local taxes are included for a non-exempt foreign corporation. Over a longer stretch, from 2011 through 2015, Carnival reported combined net profits of $7.29 billion and paid just $44 million in United States taxes across those 5 years, a rate under 1% annually. Carnival's own most recently reported effective tax rate sits at 0.7%. One industry-wide estimate puts the average tax rate across major cruise lines at roughly 0.8%, more than 20 points below the standard corporate rate that a comparable land-based hospitality company would actually pay. The labor side of the same legal structure works on identical logic, just applied to people instead of profits. Registering under a flag of convenience lets a cruise line apply that flag country's labor standards to everyone working on board, rather than the labor standards of the United States, where the ships actually dock, or of the crew members' own home countries, where most of them actually come from. The one real floor that exists globally is something called the Maritime Labor Convention, an international agreement that came into force in 2013 and covers roughly 1.2 million seafarers worldwide. It sets minimums for food, medical access, and contract terms, but on hours, it permits shifts of up to 14 hours in a 24-hour period, or up to 77 hours in a single week, with no mandated day off built in at all, only a minimum number of hours of rest between shifts. Carnival and Royal Caribbean, both public companies required to disclose compensation data, reported median crew pay of around $15,000 for the year in 2022. Cruise lines recruit heavily from the Philippines, India, and Indonesia specifically, paying wages that are often meaningfully higher than what those same workers could earn at home, while remaining far below what an equivalent hospitality job would pay in the United States or Europe for the same hours and the same work. The contract structure locks that arrangement in on the employer's terms almost completely. Crew members widely describe a termination practice, sometimes called the 6 a.m. knock, where ship security arrives at a cabin without warning and instructs the employee to pack their belongings and disembark at the very next port, with essentially no onboard process to dispute it. If a worker is injured, underpaid, or unfairly dismissed and wants to actually contest it, the dispute typically has to go through arbitration governed by the laws of whichever country the ship happens to be registered in, not the courts of the country where the worker actually lives, and not the courts of the country where the ship actually docks most of the time either. The pandemic crisis didn't arrive without warning either. As early as mid-February of 2020, an outbreak aboard the Diamond Princess, a ship with a passenger capacity of only about 3,700, had already infected more than 700 people and killed 14, demonstrating well before most of the industry's ships stopped sailing just how quickly the virus could spread in that kind of enclosed environment. Cruise lines kept ships operating and kept crew contracts running for weeks after that outbreak was public knowledge, a decision that later drew congressional scrutiny in the United States over how the industry had handled early warning signs it already had in hand. That's the ordinary, everyday version of the mechanism, the one running quietly underneath an entire, booming, growing global industry in any normal year. The pandemic did not create a new problem. It simply removed the one thing that had always kept this structure invisible to the public: constant passenger turnover and a steady schedule that made short, difficult contracts tolerable because everyone knew exactly when they would end. Once ports closed, and repatriation stalled through the spring of 2020, that structure turned into something closer to captivity for the people still living inside it. Contracts that were supposed to run 6 to 8 months stretched on indefinitely with no clear end date. Communication with home was often unreliable. Some crew members went unpaid or underpaid for stretches of that period, according to multiple contemporary reports and testimony collected by labor advocates and journalists covering the crisis. Reports of onboard hunger strikes surfaced by May of that year, as crew members ran out of other ways to pressure companies into speeding up repatriation efforts that, in Carnival's case, were not formally announced at scale until late April, using a rotation of 18 ships to gradually bring workers home over the following weeks. Even after that announcement, thousands of workers remained stuck in place for additional weeks or months, while ships slowly cycled through anchorage positions off the coast of the Bahamas and Panama. The nearly dozen non-coronavirus deaths reported among cruise crew that spring, several of them confirmed suicides, several more suspected, were not a random cluster of unrelated tragedies. They were what the ordinary structure of cruise ship labor looked like once the one variable that normally made it survivable, a fixed and predictable endpoint, got taken away. Here's where the accountability actually lands, and it lands almost entirely on one side. The crew members who died, went unpaid, or spent months trapped in tiny cabins in 2020 were disproportionately from the Philippines, India, Indonesia, and Ukraine, exactly the countries these companies recruit most heavily from in ordinary years, specifically because the wage gap makes cruise work attractive despite the conditions. The companies themselves faced essentially no structural consequence. Carnival, Royal Caribbean, and Norwegian all resumed regular sailing within roughly a year. None of them changed their country of incorporation. None of them abandoned their flag of convenience registration. Carnival's effective tax rate in the years since has stayed in the same fractional range it was in before the pandemic ever happened. It's also not just a 2020 story that quietly resolved itself once the immediate crisis passed. The broader flag of convenience shipping system that cruise lines borrowed this entire structure from is, by the most recent available data, getting worse rather than better. The International Transport Workers Federation recorded 337 ship abandonment cases in 2025 alone, a 31% increase over the year before, with abandoned seafarers collectively owed $25.8 million in unpaid wages, of which $16.5 million was actually recovered. 82% of those abandoned ships were registered under a flag of convenience. Indian seafarers were the single most affected group, with more than 1,100 abandoned in 2025, followed by Filipino, Syrian, Indonesian, and Ukrainian workers, the same nationalities the cruise industry itself draws from most heavily. That's the actual shape of this business once you follow it past the pool deck and the buffet line, the structure that let a handful of cruise companies incorporate in small foreign countries, pay a fraction of a percent in corporate tax, and apply a labor law floor that permits 77-hour weeks with no guaranteed day off is the exact same structure that turned a global pandemic into a stranding crisis with a documented cluster of worker suicides in a single month. Nothing about that structure was repaired or replaced afterward. The tax rates stayed the same, the flags of registration stayed the same, and the wider maritime system it was borrowed from is currently abandoning more seafarers, not fewer, 5 years later. None of this requires any single company to have broken a law, which is precisely what makes it durable rather than a scandal that eventually gets shut down. Every piece of it, the foreign incorporation, the flag state labor standards, the arbitration clauses, the 77-hour workweek ceiling, is fully legal under the exact international framework that's supposed to protect seafarers in the first place. A business model doesn't need to break the rules to produce a stranded, unpaid, and occasionally suicidal workforce. It just needs the rules themselves to have been written decades ago by an industry that got to pick which country's laws would apply to it before anyone else in the room had a vote.